Hello, and welcome back to the Dhawq Podcast. We're putting out an episode after a very long break, and for that, we do have a good explanation. But before that, I'd like to get right into it and introduce our guest for today. And for today's episode, I'm quite excited because it's a topic that I've been meaning to explore for a very long time, and I can't think of a better speaker to speak on this topic than the guest that we've had the privilege of hosting today. Dr. Syed Hammad Ali is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work engages sociology, epistemology, and metaphysics in sustained dialogue with the Islamic intellectual tradition and classical wisdom philosophies. He earned his PhD in sociology from the University of Calgary in Canada in 2021 as a recipient of the prestigious SSHRC Doctoral Fellowship. His doctoral research examined religious worldviews and social attitudes across Muslim-majority societies and among Muslims in the US, earning multiple awards for its methodological rigor, analytical sophistication, and conceptual depth. Prior to his doctorate, Dr. Ali completed 3 master's degrees, an MBA and an MPhil in human resource management with honors from Pakistan, and an MSc in management, policy and strategy from the University of Lethbridge in Canada. He has extensive training in quantitative methods and statistical modeling, and through the University of Waterloo's Watt-Speed program, has received advanced professional training in data science. Dr. Ali currently serves as a senior researcher with the Canadian Federal Government Agency, where he leads projects in policy analysis, social research, and applied analytics. Parallel to his academic and professional work, Dr. Ali has pursued rigorous training in the Islamic scholarly sciences, studying Usul al-Fiqh, Usul al-Hadith, and Sufi metaphysics, and receiving ijaza in Al-Siha al-Sitta. This dual formation, combining modern social science with classical intellectual and spiritual traditions, shapes his distinctive approach to questions of knowledge, meaning, and the critique of modern and postmodern paradigms. Dr. Ali, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Abdullah, for this introduction. And thank you for this invitation. And I'm looking forward to our engagement with regards to the topic at hand.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The pleasure is all ours. So, without further ado, I'll just jump right into it. The topic that we wanted to explore today was Taoism, and specifically how Taoism actually connects to Islamic metaphysics, or what is the area of confluence and where do these different, schools of thought possibly diverge. And then there's a bit as well more that I wanted to explore with you. But before we get into that, could I just ask you, in your own words and based on your own research, what is Taoism? Like, if you had to give a elevator pitch to somebody about what Taoism is, what would that be?
So when we're talking about Taoism, we need to first of all recognize that Taoism is a revealed sapiential sacred tradition. It is not a philosophical way only, or with an ethical system or an abstract philosophy. And this is an important recognition that Taoism, from this perspective, means it's a revealed religion. And if you would allow me, I would like to expand on this further.
Please go for it.
So what do I mean by revealed religion? And why did I immediately mention that it is not this, a system of New Ageism, for example, or a philosophical system? The reason is that in today's day and age, Taoism is often seen as a philosophical outlook. So, for example, I remember when I was researching about Taoism, the main book of Taoism is Tao Te Ching. Now, there's this one book in the library that I noticed and just shows you how it is seen from today's contemporary way. So the title of the book was Tao Te Ching, a philosophical translation. And when I opened the book, all the philosophical terms I've been trying to connect with that, or seeing it from a New Age perspective, New Age movement. So Taoism is not that. What is Taoism? Taoism explains the metaphysical truths that are found in other religions as well, both the Abrahamic faith and the non-Abrahamic faith. So if we look into Taoism, what we notice is that it's a revealed sacred tradition. The Tao Te Ching functions correspondingly to the revealed world scriptures, for example, the Bible, the Torah. Number one. Number two, it conveys the metaphysical truth. The metaphysical truth, which, as we're going to be having this discussion, we'll see closely corresponds to Sufism or Islamic metaphysics. So, but when I'm going to be talking about furthermore Daoism, I'm going to be talking from three levels: metaphysical aspect, epistemological aspect, and what is the outcome of embracing Tao. So it's not going to be a historical approach that I'll be taking. It's based on recognizing that Taoism provides profound wisdom that is found in other faiths as well.
Tell me more about the metaphysical foundations of it to start.
Yeah.
Like, what is it? Expound.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And just before that, I just wanted to speak a bit about Tao Te Ching itself, which is the main scripture of Taoism. The person to which this text is attributed, his name is Lao Tzu. Certain scholars are of the opinion that, historically doesn't even exist, but that is not the case. He was a historical individual. Research suggests that, and this is the perspective of Isitsu, Dr. Syed Hussein Nasr, that he came many centuries before Hazrat Isa alayhi salam. And this book has around 81 chapters, and it kind of corresponds to the Juzu Amma, the last juz of the Quran, in terms of being short chapters. It has aphoristic expression, so with minimum words, it has expended multiple metaphysical truths embedded to it. So coming to this, let's start with what is its metaphysical outlook that it presents. And, this would kind of also connect with, once we talk about the correspondence between Islamic metaphysics and Tao Te Ching. So first of all, we need to recognize that it talks about Tao. Now, what is Tao? Tao is the way. So Tao Te Ching can also be translated as the book of the way and its virtue. But Tao is that supreme principle, that absolute principle that is beyond any description. So that is Tao. And then it is determined, and from it flows the creation. So in other words, it talks about Tao being absolute reality, and Tao Te Ching teaches the way to reach it, and it is beyond naming, concept, and determination. And if we look at its first chapter immediately, which I'll be reading, it gives us a metaphysical understanding about reality. It sees reality as having hierarchy. So, for example, in the first chapter, it talks about the Tao, of which one can speak as Tao is not the eternal Tao. So here, immediately, the idea is that of Godhead and personal God. And we will see how this is also connected to Islamic teachings. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth, while the named is the mother of the 10,000 things. So you can immediately see that from that comes the absolute reality, which has no determination, Godhead, personal God, and from personal God, the attributes manifested leads to the 10,000 things. And what are those attributes, one can say? Then there's in chapter 42, Thou begets one, one begets two, the 10,000 things carry on their backs the yin and embrace in their arms the yang. So the yin and the yang are the complementary polarities through which the Tao manifests itself in the world. In other words, the 10,000 things are a reflection, are expressions of yin and yang. And this yin and yang are connected to the Sufi understanding of the divine names being Jamal and Jalal. Are the feminine attributes, the yang are the masculine attributes. And so you can see immediately that connection. But the idea is that here we can clearly see levels of hierarchy. That there's the Tao that cannot be named. And the Tao is that is the Godhead. And then there's the personal God, which is the supreme principle. And from the supreme principle emanates all of the reality, the cosmos. And those cosmos are reflecting, expressing the yin and the yang, which are the feminine and the masculine complementary aspects of Tao.
Okay, that is quite fascinating. And before I go into more questions on what you just mentioned, you mentioned Sufism and you mentioned Islamic metaphysics, and on this podcast, we've had numerous guests who've talked about Sufism, so we won't go into that too much for today's episode. But could you briefly, just maybe very quickly, tell us, according to your understanding, what is Sufism, and then how does that? You've already kind of got into it with the similarities, like what are the confluence between the two worldviews? Because then I have a follow-up question after that, but I'll let you speak on this first.
So I just also want to mention here about Taoism a bit more so that we can then connect it to Sufism. Even in Taoism, there are two types of knowledges that it teaches about: the discursive knowledge and that intuitive knowledge. And it says the whole intent of following the way of Tao teachings is to embrace the Tao. So that that is why it's known that this book is known as the book of the way and its virtues. So how can we embrace Tao in our reality, in our life? So it talks about the knowledge from two different aspects: the rational knowledge and the experiential knowledge. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because at the end, what Tao wants and what Sufi teachings are also explaining, or the intent, the end goal is similar. But coming to that question about you asking what is Sufism, Sufism is that actualization and that experience of Tawheed, of that oneness, that one divine reality. To experience that, to actualize that, that comes through Sufism. It is based on that hadith, because we have that hadith, it's in Sahih Bukhari, known as Hadith Jibreel, that Jibreel alayhi salam came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he asked, what is Islam, what is Iman, and what is Ihsan? Now, Islam, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam explained, are the 5 pillars. And these 5 pillars, who looks into it? The fuqaha, the legal school of thought, the jurisprudence aspect of Islam, the jurists. What about Iman? That is done by the mutakallim, the theologians. They look into it, what is Iman with regards to prophethood, books, eschatology, and all that. And then the Prophet was asked, what is Ihsan? And he said, An ta'budullaha ka'annaka tara. You worship Allah, and the word ta'budu is derived from abada, which means also adore. You adore Allah as if you see Him. So Sufism is the path in which one can experience the ultimate reality through extinguishing themselves. So man arafa nafsahu fa arafa rabbah. One who knows their own soul knows the divine. And then a person reaches the state where they know they're nothing, and there's only al-haq. So that is Sufism in one perspective. And then the idea is what at the end, and that comes through what? Through becoming al-insan al-kamil. So that notion of at-takhalluq bi asma'illah, that means to assume the trace of the divine names.
And in terms of the confluence between Taoism and Sufism, could you speak a little on that?
Yeah. So talking from a metaphysical level, clearly we see that in Sufism, and in Islamic metaphysics, there's the notion of laysa kamislihi shay'un. There's nothing like him, and that is like he is above every determination. He's beyond any limit, any form of thinking. Subhanallah amma yasifun. So that is Godhead. That is who. And then you have personal God, and that is Allah, Rabb, with all his divine attributes. You see the same thing in Taoism. And it's very interesting. A religion that comes way before Islam and yet has the same idea. And then you have Islamic metaphysics. And so it talks about the Tao that cannot be named, and that Tao, it's not, it's different than the eternal Tao. The idea is that there's that Godhead, absolute, beyond any determination. And then you have the Tao that is named. And that's the first level. And then second, it's so amazing to see that it talks about yin and yang, which is very close to the notion of Jamal and Jalal. And to God belongs the beautiful names, and all the beautiful names in Islamic metaphysics is seen through these two ways, which is Jamal and Jalal. So Jamal, Rahim, Kareem, Al-Wadud. Al-Wadud means the lover, the beloved. And Jalal, magnificent, majestic qualities, right? For example, Al-Qadir, the powerful one. Al-Aziz, the mighty. And what is interesting is that it says, the whole world, فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wheresoever we turn, there's the face of the divine. And that face of the divine, it's expressing the beautiful names of Allah Azza wa Jal. So immediately you see at the metaphysical level. That's one thing. Then you look at it from an so this is the ontological aspect. And then you look at the epistemological way. Both traditions talk about two approaches, rational thinking and that intuitive thinking. We have ilmul husuli. Ilmul husuli means acquired learning that we get through universities. Now, that type of knowledge leads at most to ilmul yaqeen or ainul yaqeen, intermediate level of certainties. But it doesn't lead to haqqul yaqeen. That can only come through ilmul huduri, the presential knowledge. And so that is why you find similar statements in both Taoist teachings and Islamic teachings about knowledge. So what is interesting is that even this hadith that I spoke about, Anta'budullaha ka'annaka tara, adore God as if you see him. The word ka here means as if, imagine, through this imaginal thinking. So in Islam, there's the imaginal thinking, rational thinking. Through imaginal thinking, you're able to embrace and see God. And that is known as, tashbih, eminence. And where else through the rational thinking, the more you think rationally, the further the divine is. But the more you think from that imaginal thinking, the closer the divine is. So with the Prophet ﷺ, through this hadith, we can see says ka'annaka, as if. So there is the imaginal thinking given to us. Similarly, if you look at in Daoism, it says if one pursues learning, yes, knowledge increases day by day. If one pursues Dao, knowledge decreases day by day. What type of knowledge is talking about? Here's the thing. When you're going to do rational thinking, you're going to make any idea, any subject into further components, break it logically into further blocks. And that leads you away from the truth. But if you take that intuitive presential, ilmul huduri means presential knowledge, you embrace all types of forms coming into your mind. What happens is that in this way, what happens is that the person starts to know who then themselves are. And that's where it comes, man arafa nafsahu fa arafa rabbahu. Which interestingly is also something similar is found in, I would say, Taoism in terms of saying that, and I'm looking for that, that in a certain chapter, it talks about that the clever is one who knows others, but the wise is one who knows themselves.
Yeah.
So this is the difference. One can be clever. That can come through rational thinking. You can know other things. You can further break down stuff. But you're going to become wise when you know yourself. And so you can see these two types of knowledges, same thing both teachings are giving. But what is also interesting is that if you look at the end, it talks about, at the end of the day, in Taoism, that notion of wu wei, which is non-action.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
And how that is actually connected to the notion of insan al-kamil from a Sufi metaphysic perspective as well.
Yeah. So actually, I'm really glad you brought that up, because now I'm going to stop questioning you as a podcast interviewer, more as somebody who genuinely, wants to know for himself as well. And is very curious, because I did a little bit of research as well before the podcast. And when I was reading about the concept of Wu Wei, which I'm glad you mentioned yourself, which is the act of non-doing, I had a very interesting reaction in my mind to this concept, because on one level, it seemed so counterintuitive, especially, when you think of it as a Muslim. You're supposed to wake up for Fajr, you're supposed to pray 5 times a day, you're supposed to do mujahada against yourself and in society, which is a struggle. You're supposed to, Islam is not a passive religion, it's more of an active participle. Like, you need to go out and, perform the actions that God has predicated of you. So on one level, I felt that, how can one reconcile the idea of Wu Wei with the Islamic tradition? But then on a deeper level, something was telling me that, this, it in its counterintuitiveness, it's intuitive. So, the less you do, the more it is, sort of situation. So I really wanted, but that's just my own interpretation, but I wanted you to explore first of all, what it is, where it's mentioned in the Tao Te Ching, and in what context. And then how does one reconcile that with a tradition like Islam, where you're actually ordered to do certain acts, pretty much every single day?
Right. Thank you so much for this question. It's a very interesting question. And when I was, studying about Taoism, immediately this notion of Wu Wei came to in my mind as well, how is this connected to Sufism? Well, which I kind of felt like, yes, there's a very close correspondence. But before I talk about that, let's understand what Wu Wei is. Now,
Yes,
Wu Wei
please.
basically means it's an
Mm.
effortless action, or a non-action, right? It's to be in a state of non-action. And I'll just read some of the chapters from Tao Te Ching. So, for example, chapter 37, Tao is permanently in the state of non-action, yet it leaves nothing undone. If lords and kings be able to abide by this principle, the 10,000 will grow up and develop of their own accord. Chapter 2, the 10,000 things arise around the sage, but he rejects none of them. He fosters them up, yet he claims no possession. He does great things, but he does not boast of his own work. He accomplishes his task, but does not stick to his own merit. He simply does not stick to his merit, thus his merit never deserts him. And the last one, which I would like to read, is with regards to that which, in another chapter, that which is crooked will remain unbent. That is perfect. That which is bent will become straight. That which is hollow will become filled. That which is worn out will become renewed. Now, all of this, what does it indicate? Everything is a manifestation of the Tao, or that ultimate reality's divine names. There's a hadith which says, give to each thing its due right. So the notion of effortless action is that one does not do a certain thing based on their ego. One does a thing based on that thing's haq.
Mm.
If to each thing its due right. So it is remove your ego. So for example, and we can speak about later about the example, that's the first thing. Remove the ego part and give that right, then give that thing its due right. So for example, if you see something, like someone has said something to you that may have hurt you, you don't have to take revenge, because the moment you take revenge, that's kind of like an ego coming into play. That person, if he's showing anger, that is a reflection of that Jalal attribute. And what is the haq of a Jalal attribute? You stay away from it.
Mm.
The haq of a Jalal attribute is to stay away from it. So this is the idea that things, whatever they're, whatever they are, you embrace it, you let it come, and you will solve it based on its due right. For another example that I like to think about is, as human beings, we get a lot of doubts, about reality, about faith, perhaps. But if one recognizes this is also manifestation of the divine reality, because it is God who plans, right, from the Muslim perspective.
Mm.
And it is God who guides, and it is He who misleads as well. We understand that these are the divine attributes, and we just embrace them. Whenever there's a problem that comes, what do? You show patience. Give each thing its due right. So it's simply that whatever is happening, I'll give you an example. This may be more like I would say a personal example. This way of looking at the world has really helped me. My third son was born February 6, 2024. And I would not want anyone ever to go through that, like what I've gone through, in the sense that he had to stay in NICU for 2 months. For 2 months, he was in the hospital. My older two kids, they also became unwell when they were at home. And here's the thing. I felt at that time, and I don't recall ever, God forbid if I did, I don't recall ever complaining about this. It was simply something that came. And by the way, it does say in the Quran that God will test you with beautiful bala. Bala means at trials. So with beautiful trials. So immediately in my mind, it came that because God has said that He is beautiful and He creates everything which is beautiful. Allazi ahsana kulla shay'in khalaqa. Everything is created is beautiful. Even this trial is beautiful. Now, because this is a trial, what do? Effortless. Wu wei. Sabr. Patience. And when you do patience, inna Allah ma sabirin. That is what I feel Wu Wei is. Because what happens when you give each thing its due right, that's where the transformation is happening, where you become Al-Insan Al-Kamil. So, for example, someone has said mean things to you. It doesn't matter. Why? The divine has permitted this way of speaking to that person. You forgive that person because God forgives. But if someone is, you see, for example, mistreating your loved ones, and you have the responsibility. That's where you stand, not for your sake, but from that perspective of that God is just as well. So you're showing that type of attribute now.
Mm.
So this is the way that you're letting things manage through their own way.
May I quickly ask a question
Yes.
here? First of all, thank you so much for sharing that personal story as well. It was quite moving. When we talk about Wu Wei, is it also a detachment from outcomes? Could one think of it this way that, and I'll give you another example. Let's suppose somebody you know is hurting, and you want to help them, and you try your best to help them, and you end up feeling, oh, sorry, not to, sorry, you try to help them, but they end up not being helped. Like they just refuse to accept your help, for example. Or in another context, you're trying to protect somebody from something, and you're not able to do that, and the outcome ends up being something that your action did not predicate. So then, does Wu Wei also mean sort of that concept of tawakkul, where it is that I let go, whatever I did my best, and whatever outcome now happens, it's not in my hand. Is that
Yes.
also Wu
Yes.
Wei?
So you do the action and you don't care about the outcome. The
Mm.
outcome is also expression of Tao. That is the expression of the divine names.
Mm.
If something comes out that doesn't appeal to you, for example, as in that person, well, you have to understand, and this is where I talk about, even the curves of the eyebrow is straight.
Mm.
If the bow and arrow, if the bow is not curved, it cannot be a bow. It
Mm.
cannot shoot an arrow. So everything is perfect in its own way.
Mm.
And we are only doing not with the intent that this is the outcome. You see, we shouldn't even like the outcome comes from the divine. We are only doing what is given to us is that how to respond to a given situation in such a way that we're able to remove this libas, this limited libas. And what do I mean by this? This temporary level of reality that we have, and recognize who we are.
Mm.
For if we look at ourselves, we are the mirror of that divine believer. There's a
Mm.
hadith in Islam, the believer is the mirror of the believer. Al-Mu'min
Yeah.
is the mirror of Al-Mu'min. And what happens is that we're simply going at that level of who we truly are. We are the believer who has been the mirror of that divine believer. And also,
Beautiful.
Inna Allah khalaqa Adama ala suratihi. God created Adam in his image.
Mm.
So this is our divine. And then also that he blew his spirit into Adam. So we're trying to go through this journey from this lowest level of reality to the ultimate reality that that is our ultimate goal. And that comes through following that Wu Wei approach,
Mm.
which is to give each thing its due right, to become in Islamic metaphysics the idea of al-insan al-kamil, the complete human being.
Beautiful. That is a beautiful explanation of this concept. Um, as we kind of come towards the conclusion of like our talk, I have one subject that I wanted to explore with you on this, and I think that's probably the most pertinent one, which is that we live in postmodern times. Modernity has ravaged our minds, in general, whether you live in a religious country, quote unquote, non-religious country, Muslim country, Christian majority country, an atheistic country. Um, Even for believers, our frame of mind has now been hijacked by modernity. And we look at everything in terms of, from that paradigm. So one of the maxims of modernity that I've noticed, if you look at the corporate world, if you look at the world of business, is that the hustle culture, which is that more, more, more. I need to work hard. I need to do this. I need to, by age 35, you must have done X, Y, Z. And, then there's this whole culture of self-help books and, that world. And I'm not like, saying anything negative towards that, but I'm just saying that there is a hyper emphasis on more, more, more. And you need to do more, achieve more. You need to take control, grab the bull by the horns, so to speak. So one of the consequences of that, obviously, is that people have perpetual anxiety. You're constantly comparing yourself to people. You're constantly competing. And people are like, depressed because of that. So how do you think, and we can kind of land our plane with this one, is that with what you've talked about Taoism and, these classical traditions, how can they be an antidote to modern man's anxiety? And I'll quickly just elaborate that a bit. So, we're not encouraging monasticism either. We're not telling people to stop working and just go sit in a corner and meditate. So how does one, balancing is the toughest thing in the world. If I was to speak for myself, like on the one hand, balancing detachment with working hard and actually achieving your goals. So, you've had the experience of, you've worked in academia and you've also worked in the corporate world. So you have a very unique experience, and you've spoken to people who are like from different worlds. How does one synthesize that where you're working hard for your goals, but you're also following the Taoist principle of Wu Wei and not attaching yourself to the outcome?
Well, that's a very profound question. And one thing I would mention here is that, you mentioned one's goal. And that's where we have to recognize that the modern world does not focus on the goal being the center. Everything is peripheral. Is it not better to focus on the center and things will get solved by themselves? Anything that happens to a person, it has to be good because Tao itself is good. Number one. Number two, from an Islamic perspective, Allazi ahsana kulla shayin khalaqa, everything He's created is good. فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. So if you see anywhere there's the face of the beloved, that is Allah. In other words, you can be in a state of paradise. You can be in a place of paradise in this world if you recognize that whatever is happening to you, whatever is happening to a human being is simply the different faces of the beloved being shown. Now, if the beloved, for the, in Persian Sufism, in Muslim tradition, there's always the story of Layla and Majnun. Layla says anything to Majnun, for him it's nothing but good news because it's the words of Layla. That's one thing. So that we have to recognize from that level, anything that is happening to us, it's nothing but good. The divine names, the beloved's beautiful names, the divine beloved beautiful faces can be seen if the veil is removed. And this veil is the dunya from one perspective. Of course, there's the divine names themselves are the veils, but at least the veils of this dunya. Now, once you understand that, there's nothing to worry about. Number one. Number two, this world is temporary. It's not real. The goal is something else. That is to attain visal, union with the beloved. And that's where comfort happens. Number three, the reason I think that a lot of people have so much focus on this more and more and more is because they've forgotten that reality is not based on material level. Reality is based on something that is up beyond materialism. And now what happens is that because people are not focused on the idea of, divine reality, people don't talk about that there's something more, because in the traditional philosophy, the idea was that reality had these three levels of reality. Three levels. And what do I mean by that? There was the body, there was the soul, and there was the spirit. And there was the understanding across traditional societies that spirit is the highest level of reality. So the idea was that we came in this world so that we could reach that highest level of reality, which is the spirit, which reaches that connection or approximation or closeness to that divine reality. So this was the goal. Now, because we don't have this framework, and everything is relativism in a way. So what can be seen and agreed by everyone is material wealth. So everyone is seeking that. But at what cost? At what cost? People work for hours and hours and they die much earlier because they're stressed. And why are they stressed? Because they have not been able to understand that whatever is happening to them in truth is nothing but good if they experience it from that way. Now, if someone says, oh, this is all baloney and can be, my kid was in 2 months in the NICU. I could have seen it from that perspective, or I could have seen it as a beautiful time, as a beautiful moment where I have to show patience. Isn't it better to show patience during that time? And also interestingly, now there is so much, and not just think about this, all thinking that comes into our mind, how do we define it? We define something as good and bad. Isn't that now subjective from one perspective? Why not see this anything as good? So that's one. And secondly, also from workplaces, that if you're working, why not see it as a form of ibadah rather than a form of focusing on worldly success? And I'm not saying you as in you, but in a general context, like if I'm working, hey, I'm working for clients to make their life better. that in a way is a positive way of looking, rather than thinking, hey, I'm going to work like this, do these projects so that I can get more promotions. What's the benefit at the end of earning so much? Because, sure, there's comfort, but if having existential crisis within the mind, that's not peaceful. So there's so much, like, we need to understand that another reason that we're kind of also, as human beings, going through a lot of anxiety and depression is that we are away from the center. We live in a very challenging times, because on one side we say everything's relative. As human beings, we do not feel that. We're like, no, love is something. And then we see that, if everything is relativism, but there's certain ideas being promoted in the society that we have to adhere. Why do we have to adhere? And then there's the idea that, life is nihilistic in a sense, it's meaningless. But no, there is some meaning being given the moment when I take the idea that I have to earn more. So we're living in this confusion. And the reason is that we're living in the peripherals rather than being in the center. And that center can only come when one follows the way towards the Tao, the way towards who? That is Allah. And that's where true salvation, comfort comes.
Beautiful. I don't think you could have put this any better than that. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts to add for our listeners and our viewers? Anything else that you'd like to speak on?
One thing I would like to highly mention is that, all these religions talk about different levels of reality. And in today's day and age, we're just focused on this materialistic level. By materialistic level, I mean, this way of looking that there's only one reality, that everything is composed of atoms. And that has its impact, because now the focus is simply on like material wealth. There's that impact perhaps. But having said that, you need to understand, in order to reach the ultimate reality, you have to understand that we are simply more than components of atom. There's something within us. And like Islam says, man arafa nafsahu fa arafa rabbahu. One who knows their self, they will know their divine. One needs to do an inward journey to seek that ultimate truth. And when one has that ultimate truth, they'll find bliss. That is, they'll find happiness in their life.
Beautiful. Dr. Ali, thank you so much for taking the time out. And I know this was, very profound, and I'm sure our listeners, they're going to appreciate your, insight into Taoism, Sufism, and how these traditions can act as an antidote to the anxiety of the modern man. But once again, thank you so much. And I hope to have you once again on the podcast very soon.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.